Hello everyone, Strategic Sage back as promised with a deep dive into the new campaign types for AI War 2. I'll be looking at what the campaign types do, why are they even in the game to begin with, what are some differences between them, how's it going to impact your gameplay. And this is really a rare situation in which I'm uniquely qualified to talk about this because I'm personally responsible for a large part of the design, what's presently in the game. Now, of course, that's a double-edged sword. Because if you like it, great. But if you don't, I'm also interested in your feedback also. And I'm the one to blame if that's the case. So feel free to open up your verbal cannons, fire both barrels, reload again while you're at it. All part of the fun. Of course, none of this would have happened without the generous support of Chris Park, the developer over at Arkham Games. And for those who don't know, this came out of a discussion that him and I had about AI War 2 almost a year ago. He suggested separating into multiple campaign types so that players who are looking for quite a bit different experience out of AI War 2 could still get it. And I can probably count on one hand the number of developers who would even think about doing something like that. So it's really an incredible thing. A number of people volunteered over at Arkham without being asked to contribute various pieces of this. There's been testing and feedback and ideas from a wide range of people, and none of this happens without that assistance either. So there are 6 campaign types in the game now. And we're going to start with Humanity Ascendant, as this is the baseline experience. If you're completely new to AI War 2, I'm going to suggest there are a couple of playlists among the list in the description that are tutorialish in bent, or check out the Arkham Games Discord. Get to know the game a little bit, and then you'll understand more some of the concepts I'll be talking about. But Humanity Ascendant, again, the default campaign type, Chris's description here is very excellent. Dynamic, aggressive, reward-seizing territory, cat and mouse war. It's not so much defensive. You're building up enough so that you can defeat the AI without drawing so much attention to yourself that they crush you. Now, there's some of that had changed, however, prior to about a year ago. If you played AI War 2 in the past year, this is really the experience that you're used to. Before that, there were some things that were different. Research was more incentivized to be tall instead of wide, and therefore you had a more narrow choice on any given galaxy what ships you could effectively choose. And I think it was definitely a good idea to make that more wide, give people more choices. A lot more hacking options were put in, including some very powerful ones. There's some new capturables that weren't present before. And then there are some capturables that you could lose that would really hurt you if you lose them and you had to defend them. Talking about the Global Command Augmenters and the Intergalactic Coordinators for those who were around and remember those. But if you were defending those and the AI destroyed them, then you lost part of your military that you had captured from them, and your situation could actually be worse than before you took them. So that type of risk-reward felt very punishing to a lot of players. And when the move was made to go to this Humanity Ascendant type of gameplay, it was really popular. It was something that most players really liked. What I don't want to do here is be in a situation where judging anybody for how they like to play. We're just describing the different ways. But there were some people who took a couple of other reactions to that. So let's take, for example, people who just wanted more. Because there were some people, if we look at our map population here, we're just going to look at some defaults. We have data centers, okay, 6 and 2, and you can see the maximum we go up to 9, 5, 12 here on the distribution nodes. Defaults to 6, defaults to 3 tech vaults, and you can move it up to 5. So with Humanity Ascendant, you can move all these different sliders around and create the experience you want, but it's within certain guardrails. Players looking for additional options express that with statements such as, I don't want to optimize, I want to choose based on the ships or turrets or units that are interesting to me, not necessarily what the best choice is. I just enjoy AI War 2 for the wide variety that's available, and I want the game to facilitate that without me having to reduce the difficulty, because that just feels bad to me. For that type of player, we have added Sandbox. So, no achievements available here, but it allows for a much wider range available in the galaxy. So if we turn that on, the default levels stay the same on all these. We can really push up the tech vaults, though, up to a total of 20. A lot more data centers, a lot more distribution nodes, etc. You can push the envelope if that's the level of flexibility that you're looking for. For my part, I had much different goals, and this would eventually lead to the 4 other campaign types, Challenger through Deathwish in graduated steps. We'll get back to what those do specifically, but I want to emphasize that the goal here was not to make AI War 2 harder for the sheer sake of it being harder. That's at most a nice ancillary side benefit. It is true that Humanity Ascendant had shifted the balance of the game a little over 1 difficulty level in the player's favor, roughly, from where it had previously been. And tilting that back, there is some value there, but it's trivial to just add difficulty if that's all you want to do. For example, you could take every AI ship in the galaxy, send it at the player, attack them immediately at the start of the game, overwhelm them before they have a chance to set up or defend. Well, this would be terrible and stupid, and nobody wants that. The aim is more having a experience that is challenging, but challenging in a strategic and interesting way. My sort of touchstone on this is Sid Meier's famous maxim that defines a game as a series of interesting decisions. And from my perspective, for a player who is perhaps of above average skill, fairly experienced in the game, as Humanity Ascendant added more options, more choices, more power to the player, there are more total choices, but I felt that the number of actually interesting or compelling choices had been reduced. This may appear to be a paradox, so let's look at a couple of key examples. One is the idea of having to defend critical infrastructure in various places in the galaxy, or not having to do that. In Humanity Ascendant, the only planet that you have to defend and can't afford to lose is your starting home command station. It's beneficial if you're going to go out and grab major data centers or perhaps a Zenith power generator, but it's not at all mandatory and you can skip that if you don't like the risk. This really simplifies the strategic situation for you in multiple dimensions. One is what decisions you make as you go out and capture various planets. You're not as likely to be concerned about, is this too exposed? Is it risky to have this? Because if you lose it, then you simply rebuild it later and there's no permanent loss there. You might not be motivated to say, you know what, that's too risky. I'm going to go take another planet over here. That's going to be easier for me to secure. Another example of that would be as you move your fleet around and your various military assets. It's very aggression focused often. You can pool all of your ships into a big fleet ball, go around, hammer targets with maximum force. You lose a planet, bring the fleet back, rebuild that real quick, go on about what you were doing. If you have critical infrastructure that you cannot afford to lose, then you're highly incentivized to make somewhat different choices and more of a balancing act. Maybe I want to siphon off some ships for a defensive fleet that's going to go guard those locations. Maybe I want to invest more heavily in turrets. Then I'll have smaller mobile fleet overall, but I'll be more fortified in those locations that I really, really want to hang on to. So that's the type of strategic, what I would call depth and richness that we're looking for. Another example is the TSS, ARS, the various structures out in the galaxy that we're going to want to capture and or hack. Well, for the turret schematic servers, I have had players that do not share my sensibility at all in terms of what they're looking for out of AI War 2, what they enjoy about the game, who have said, you know, if there's a TSS nearby me, I know I want to capture it and I want to hack it. And I don't have to look and see what's even in it in terms of the turrets that are available. There's going to be something good there and probably multiple good things that I'm going to be interested in. Well, to me, that's a very reflexive and automatic type of decision that isn't that interesting. I think it's more interesting if you're looking at it, okay, maybe I want this. Maybe I don't. Maybe there's something that I'd like to get somewhere else because this might not be great. And then if you capture it and there isn't something great there, but you just grabbed it because you need something right now, maybe you're encouraged then to use something that's more decent, something that you wouldn't normally take, and you're experimenting with additional units. And then if you find something that's really good, that's a big moment for you. You're excited about it as opposed to, well, there's a really good thing here, but there's really good things over there and there and there. And the idea is not that we want to remove good things or fun from the galaxy. It's that there shouldn't always be great things everywhere. There should be more of a sporadic, this is good and then this isn't quite as good, and I'm going to have interesting choices which planets I'm going to want to take to get those assets. Now, looking a little bit more by way of summary in our other types here then, Challenger and up, we're locking out some of the choices in the galaxy here. So we can't put in any tech vaults. Notice that the sliders have disappeared. It says altered by campaign type or AI difficulty. And the data centers are still there, just down 1. Major data centers are the same. Distribution nodes down by 2, but the slider is not available. And the goal here again is not to remove all the good things from the galaxy. It's just to keep things in line within a certain balance level. Not that much is actually added by Challenger, but there are a number of things that people have found impactful. It's the first graduated step that is a little bit more restrictive than Humanity Ascendant. Expert is where the lion's share of it comes on. Alternate, more difficult campaign type, as is mentioned here. Notice second paragraph, you want to report the bug of having beaten the difficulty 10 AI, then you need to use Export or higher. For quite a while, that hasn't been an option because on Humanity Ascendant, nobody was really impressed at that level of it being a bug, that is, by people winning on difficulty 10. But now that should be something that can go into place again. And we'll get into the details of everything that Expert does shortly. Logistician is everything that Expert has plus fuel. And fuel adds the element of having to defend critical infrastructure. It was part of Expert until recently, but it was split off because there were players who just didn't like that requirement. And so Logistician is separate and adds the fuel in. And then Deathwish, people have noted that I'm actually mentioned here. And the main reason for this is not so much calling me out, but just that on all the other campaign types, community effort balancing, making sure things aren't too extreme, Deathwish is intentionally extreme. Not a lot of development time was spent on this, but everything that was added into Deathwish is there because I wanted to be there, and there was no second guessing or, boy, that's too much. It's just intentionally punishing to the player. Diving into the details then, starting with Challenger, shortly after you start a game, you'll be greeted by a notification letting you know you have a tip regarding that particular campaign type. This is going to describe for you the key elements that you're going to want to know to play it. And these are written by myself, with the exception of a few tweaks by others. We'll get back to the distributed economy, but enforced balance. Engineering tech costs increased along with those for direct upgrades. And this is in place because it had become a very reflexive, automatic decision for many players to just invest in those right away. And you can still do that, but now the tech cost is increased, hopefully to a point where it's more of a decision and you might want to think about whether you want to do that some of the time. Turret costs increased in terms of the metal required to build them, and ranges were decreased on non-human planets. Not affecting at all you defending your own planets that you have captured. You get the same effectiveness there. But beachheading, that is, building turrets on hostile planets, is something that had become very powerful, and advanced players had really leaned into that hard to gain a large advantage. The reason for that is how powerful turrets are. If you equalize them for what the resource requirements are, your average turret is about 5 times, perhaps more than that, more powerful than your average mobile ship. And so this is balancing that out some, so that leaning hard into beachheading is not nearly as powerful of an advantage. It still can be effective. Brula Guardians are on, and we talked about some of the other lobby options. Most of the starting fleet options are intact, but there are a couple that were particularly abusable, and those have been removed. Then the increased AI response, this is not for everything. It's not for waves, it's not for reinforcements of the AI, it's not a generalized increase in AI resources, but for some special things that the AI does, like the hacking exostrike response, dire CPAs, those will become increasingly painful as you ascend through the various campaign types. And then the AI reserves grace period, that is turned off, so when you deep strike, they're going to show up right away. They're not warning you. Then we have one additional line that has actually been added down here for the next patch. It's just not there at the time of recording, and that is reduced resources. 25 hacking instead of 30 for every planet you acquire. And also, you start out with 12,000 science instead of the previous 15,000, 48 hacking instead of 60. So you just have a little bit more pressure on your available resources to a minor degree, and you're going to want to perhaps think a bit more about some of your investments. Then distributed economy. We have talked about this briefly before on the channel, but in Humanity Ascendant, the more you might call centralized economy approach that operates on, almost all of your metal and energy are coming from your command station. In distributed economy, a great deal of that is going to come actually from your asteroid power plants spread throughout the system, which means that your economy can be attacked by the AI. It's not just a case of, well, if I protect my command station, my economy won't be hurt. So they can raid you and cause some trouble for you in that way. Another factor that this impacts is your decisions. What am I going to move out into the galaxy and capture? Because you could have systems that, for example, have something you really want. Say I really wanted this fleet, okay, but the asteroid mining power plants, there's only 2 of them. So this is a very wimpy system economically. So which is more important to me? The thing I might want to capture or the economic potential of the system in the long term? And then, for example, Newton down here, well, it has nothing really great to capture, but look at that, 8 asteroid mining power plants. And these would be great systems to build an economic command station on, but will it be too exposed? Can I protect it? So there's a bunch more factors then that you might want to weigh a little bit as you form your strategy for expanding through the galaxy. And that is the Challenger campaign. By far, Expert is the campaign type that really had the most debate and discussion back and forth going on over on the Discord as it was worked out. And the first couple of changes we're going to look at here are examples of that. So the TSS over in Armagust, if we check that out, there are 3 options available. Defaults to 4 for ARS or TSS, but now it's down to 3 on the Expert campaign. And I actually advocated for reducing it a little bit further, but that was strongly opposed by most players. So compromise, don't want perfect to be the enemy of good. 3 is the level that was arrived at. Then with the beachheading takes some more really significant changes as well, getting that back into more of an equal line. So you only have 1 battle station to begin with, instead of 2. And then, typically, the default way it works is if you do the turret line for all, the turret you hack for will be added to all of your battle stations and citadels, as well as all your command stations. Not anymore. On Expert, you're only going to get those turrets for your command stations. You want to add more for your battle stations or citadels, then you need to do the 3 times 1 here, and then you don't get them for your command stations. So it makes it much more difficult to scale up nearly as hard as you could with early turrets on your battle stations and really lean into that beachheading element. And there in fact is a special tip devoted simply to the limited battle stations and those beachheading changes. And as noticed here, CRC Gamer, probably one of the very top AI War 2 players there is, and a balance guru over at Arkan, he was responsible for this compromise and was able to work things out and understand all the angles, I think, much better than I could. So back to the other changes then in the Expert campaign. You must play with at least 2 AIs. Only 1 AI, you can get through things a lot quicker. You're not under as much pressure. 2 AIs is meaning each is going to have somewhat lower budget, but even though they're smaller, you're going to hit by twice as many CPAs, going to get hit by twice as many waves, etc. And generally, you're going to be kept off balance quite a bit more than you would with just going up against a single AI. Take it or leave it. When capturing a planet, you have to take all of the capturables available. A common technique would be to do something like, well, I want this major data center, but I don't want the golem, or the other way around. If you capture a planet, you're taking it all, or you leave the planet alone. There is no piecemeal possibility there. Distributed economy, we talked about before. The dire cross-planet attacks are now always on. A CPA bunker spawns every half an hour, and if you leave all of them up, then very soon your CPAs will become quite painful, especially if it's a longer game. Dialed up AI defenses. The nasty picks, mass drivers, eyes, etc. are more dangerous, and specifically, they are a lot tougher. They take a lot more to knock out. So it's not going to be a case of popping in, the mass driver shoots off maybe once, and a relatively small fleet can knock it out quickly. They are much more troublesome because they're going to get off more shots before you knock them down. FRS rebalancing. The fleet research station ships, which typically give several ship lines, plus a cruiser if you have them, and an officer if you have them, bonuses to shields or the hull or damage, etc. They no longer provide that fleet-wide bonus. And it says it's impossible to balance. Really, the reason for that is the FRS are a really good ship line in themselves, and you get an AIP penalty for taking them. You get one also for the cruiser, and you get one also for the officers. But they're all priced individually. And then having the FRS ships be able to apply bonuses to all of those, plus that additional capability they get, you're not paying any additional energy for that. It's just too many moving parts to really be able to balance it out, and nobody ever had really any good ideas for how to make that happen. I operated under the assumption for the last few months that we're playing on Humanity Ascendant that the FRS ships were actually the most overpowered element in the game, at least from my perspective. So that has now been eliminated. You pay a much smaller AI progress cost if you're going to hack these because they don't get the fleet bonus. But that has been done away with. And then if you have a transport flagship or officer or whatever your fleet centerpiece is, if they get crippled, in addition to the extra metal costs that you already pay for getting them back online, they will bail out to a friendly system. So it gives you more and more encouragement that you're going to want to keep those protected, because if you don't, you could lose a key fleet in the middle of a battle and have to send that flagship back, which would definitely hurt your effort in that conflict. And then increased multiplier also to the previously mentioned Exostrike response in dire CPAs. There's a higher multiplier on Expert than there was on Challenger. The Logistician campaign type takes that base of what's in Expert, staples fuel on top of it, and essentially calls it a day, although there are a couple other smaller items added, such as no more beacons and no more communication nodes. But it's pretty much about the fuel, which is really the core central feature, a new mechanic that really all of the rest of the campaign types, from Challenger through Deathwish, were sort of fitted around. Fuel was put in place, and then everything else was sort of adjusted and balanced to work with that. So, in our tips here, we again have documentation, but also fuel is a little bit more involved than the other items we've previously been going over. In how to play, I have a FAQ available, and they were very kind to add my name in there as a credit without me asking them to do so. Now, some of these are pretty long, so instead of just reading through all of them, be a little bit dry, I'm going to try to describe this visually as best as I can. So why fuel? Well, fuel fills the niche that I talked about a little bit earlier in the video, where we want to have the player defending critical infrastructure out in the galaxy beyond their home command stations. So, we have an Argon fuel station, 350,000 Argon fuel. I have proposed, and I think it probably will happen, but AI progress penalty there get removed. But these are permadeath, and frankly, the AI progress is not anywhere near the worst part of losing one of these, because you can't rebuild them, and there's a limited supply, a pretty healthy supply, but a limited supply, and you would basically often feel that you've just eaten the AI progress for taking this planet for nothing if you happen to lose these. So you really need to defend them. Fuel works very much like energy does. You need a certain amount to power your military, but your military is divided now into 3 sections, 3 pools, if you will, with one type of fuel for each. So we have Argon, that's for your mobile strike, that is your strike craft, and your frigates. Radon, going to be the most plentiful one by far. This is for all of your turrets and other static defensive structures, force fields, tachyon arrays, tractor arrays, gravity. You're also going to have your station-keeping frigates under there. Anything that's pretty much relegated to defense. And then Xenon, wildcards and super weapons. So arcs, golems, citadel, outguard, cruisers, etc. And if you run out of fuel, then what happens is, if you don't have enough to supply your whole military of that particular type, they lose effectiveness. Specifically, you lose hull, you lose shields, so durability, both types, and you're also going to lose damage output. And the penalty is severe enough that you really want to stop using, scrap units if you need to get back under whatever fuel supply you happen to have at the particular moment. And then there are multiple types of fuel stations out in the galaxy. We have the Argon. There's also one for the Radon, one for the Xenon, and more rare is there are a few of them usually in the galaxy, the balanced fuel stations, which are going to give you a little bit of each, and those are a little more valuable. So the hope here is to impact the player's decisions more on what are we going to capture, how risky is this area that has a fuel station, and then also where am I going to deploy my forces to make sure I'm defending those key points. At the start of the game, you have enough from your home command station, we can see the amounts here, to really expand and take roughly 3 additional planets. And that way, you're not under pressure right away. You get to know the galaxy a little bit. Plus, there's no point in putting the player under a lot of attack because they're not spread out far enough to have to defend critical areas. But as you move out into the galaxy more and more, you will need to grab those fuel stations and then account for how you're going to defend them as you are spread out further. When players encounter the fuel feature, there are a few common questions that come up that I'd like to handle at this stage. One is, why sort of reinvent the wheel here? Why not have structures just like the old Global Command Augmenter or Fabricators in Classic, whatever, where you capture a structure, you have specific ships or turrets that are tied to that structure, you lose a structure, you lose that particular item from your military. Well, I think that there's actually an argument at least that this is an improvement over that kind of system. Because what we're doing here with the fuel is we're giving the player control and flexibility. Say you run low on radon. That's going to be a serious situation for you because you need your defenses for your planets. But you don't have to just automatically have lost a really good turret or a whole bunch of tractor arrays or whatever. You choose what thing you take down. So you're probably going to remove whatever you think the most least effective item is in your particular arsenal to defend your planets while you work on getting more radon. But you have the control as a player. It's not something that's rigidly tied to that structure. You're just going to decide where you're going to invest that resource while you work on getting more radon. Another question that comes up is, why the 3 new resources? Why not just use energy if the fuel works fairly similar to energy? The reason for that is energy is produced at all your planets. The goal is not that the player has to defend all of their planets equally. I don't really think that's any more interesting than having to defend very few of your planets. Everything doesn't need to be critical. It's isolated key points of your infrastructure that you have to emphasize defense of. That's what we're trying to deal with here. If the goal is to be super punishing, we could do something like, say, we had control of Stade here, or whatever planet that we happen to lose. Well, you lose a planet, you can't ever rebuild your command station there. So you lose all of the capturables you got from that, and any metal or energy. I mean, I think that would be ridiculous. Nobody really wants to go in that direction. It's just the key points. And then another reason for having them split up is, for example, we do have radon much more plentiful in the galaxy so that players can adequately defend. It was definitely a design goal here that radon is not as tight as the other fuels that are needed for attack because radon's much more critical and sort of an oppressive death spiral if you started losing one resource was not desired. It has also happened that players of a particular playstyle have said, boy, it feels like every planet I need, I want another fuel station. I can't even think about grabbing a planet that doesn't have fuel. Well, that should not normally happen. But if you try to cluster up behind choke points with a whole bunch of economic stations and then just try to, have military commands all at your front and you want to be able to use all of that energy, well, fuel does not scale in that way. Fuel encourages you to spread out throughout the galaxy more. And every effort was made, so far as we could, to allow for different play styles. But it is an essential part of using fuel that you can't just cluster up behind one area. And so if you try to do that, what you're going to end up with is a situation that you have a whole bunch of energy that you don't have the fuel to use because you're going to need to spread out through the galaxy and get that fuel. So you need to combine the energy concerns with your fuel concerns and the other aspects as you proceed throughout the galaxy. Another point is that at Logistician, and then also for Deathwish, of course, because that will include the fuel as well, you really want to think a little bit about what you're going to include in your galaxy. There is a recommendation that you use a fairly open map, that is one that doesn't have a ton of choke points, and that you consider having a moderate or fewer amount of factions. Now, one of the great enjoyments that people have found with AI War 2, all the different dynamic factions that are available in the game. They're a lot of fun to play with. Chaos maps are really exciting. But Logistician and the fuel mechanic is not made for that. It simply can't adapt to all of those possibilities. Now, we've tried as much as we can. It's planned to have a shard refinery structures added so that fuel will work well with Spire. If you're playing Dark Zenith, when they invade the galaxy, there's an extra Argon fuel station there. So whatever integration we've tried has been done. But regardless of what mechanic or feature set you want to imagine, the great possibilities that are present in AI War 2, although it's a great strength of the game, really don't lend itself to trying to have a tightly controlled, challenging type of environment. Because let's say you balance it for the player, an AI, and Scourge and Nanocos. Well, what happens if you add in more of those factions? Or maybe you take one away. Or you add Dark Spire, and then maybe somebody wants to play with Splintering Spire, and somebody else wants a bunch of Devour Golems, and HRF, and Marauders, and there's so many virtually unlimited amounts of combinations that there's just no way to balance everything on the head of the pin and make it all an equal challenge no matter what you pick. That's just never going to happen. So Fuel and Logistician is focused on the central conflict between the human and the two AIs. And when I say central, again, I don't mean it's wrong to play other ways, but it's simply, if you start up a game in AI War 2, what do you come up to in the lobby? There's a human faction and an AI. You have to have both of those. The other factions are optional, but those two aren't. You can't play a game without an AI. You can't win the game without defeating the AI. So this is the core, central part of what the game is ultimately about, which again is not to throw other factions under the bus. It's just mechanically, that's how everything works. So I look forward to everybody's feedback on Fuel, but I think that's about as fair of a description as I can give it. And I will look forward to reading your comments below. And finally, the Deathwish campaign, which bears my name, amusingly called Full Sage Mode. Fairness to the player is pretty much thrown out the window in some respects, with sadistic laughter following it on its way. And this is very much accurate. This is the campaign where there's a lot that wasn't added simply due to very limited development time going into something that's admittedly extreme, but there was never a point at which, oh, well, you can't do that. That's going a little too far. If it's going too far, Deathwish is where it belongs. So extreme AI response, the multipliers for dire CPAs, exostrike responses, AI structures taking longer to destroy, etc. All of those dialed up significantly beyond even what is in Expert. And then wave warnings, gone. You're not going to know they're coming. They're just going to show up when they feel like it. You're not told about them at all. And then devastating crippling, twice the normal penalty for repairing crippled flagships, but also you have to pay hacking as sort of a simulation of having to reactivate them. And that is something that the great majority of players have really rebelled hard against. So if you play Deathwish, look, you're getting into it, you really don't want them to cripple, especially if the additional feature that I am most likely to see added here, we'll see if it comes in or not, but was permadeath of officers. Meaning, if you have a golem or an arc and it gets crippled, it ceases to be a golem or an arc. It simply becomes a regular transport flagship. So those can only be crippled once, and you lose the power that come with them. And goes without saying, that's an extremely punishing blow to take. And then reverse beachheading, tractoring the enemies to the wormholes. That's something that can very much be cheesed. Gone. You cannot build turrets at all on enemy bastion worlds or home worlds. Beachheading on planets with dire guard posts, strictly forbidden. And there are many other possible ideas, some fairly extreme, that could have been added in here. and also with some of the other campaign types, obviously. But there was a goal to, even though there's a lot here, to actually limit the campaign types to the changes that were needed. That's why we started with fuel and built around that. Because it still needed to stay AI War 2. Didn't want to totally reinvent the wheel. You know, if I could wave a magic wand, and Chris is a far, far more skilled designer than I am. Not even talking about, obviously, the fact that I am not a programmer. I mean, he's just a brilliant game maker. But if I had my choice as to, okay, if I could change things in my own vision, you know, I would probably get rid of all direct upgrades. I think that it's much more interesting to invest strategically with things that affect the entire empire as opposed to being able to target it. That's abusive and cheesy is too strong a way to put it. It just, to me, it gives you too much fine control as a player. That doesn't really help the overall game. I would have made turrets more of a global resource like ships are, as opposed to having a certain amount for each planet. You know, you have a certain amount of turrets. You decide where to divide them up among your planets. And I probably would have done things like, wouldn't have added respecking, you know. But what has come about here, except for these few items in Deathwish, really has been a community effort. And it's much better result than it would have been if it had just been, you know, Sage pointing his finger and making this happen, for sure. So I hope that you'll enjoy these. I hope this has been useful in understanding what the different campaign types do and why they do those things. Looking forward again to hearing your feedback. And going forward, I'm going to be doing, very likely, a Logistician playthrough, unless there's really strong feedback from viewers that you'd like to see me do one of the other campaign types, and then I'll consider that. And of course, probably in a month and a half, somewhere around that range, maybe a little more, we're going to be looking at the Nine Zul Abyss expansion, and I've got a special run that I'm working on how that's going to go as well. So thanks everyone for watching, and we'll see you soon.